All right. So, as Napoleon was away trying to defeat the Russians, there was already signs that his control had begun to fade. While he was away, there was nearly a coup. People had forged documents indicating that Napoleon had died. But he does return, beaten and bruised, but not defeated. In that winter, he carried on his operas and balls and court festivals and tries to rebuild his army as he's trying to make it seem as if business as usual. But his popularity was definitely waning throughout France. But people were still scared of him. I mean, he still had control over many avenues of politics. Outside of France, he even had less control. He needed to siphon off the French forces in Spain, and the British general was gaining victories in Spain, so he was losing his hold there, and the British were gaining a grasp in Spain. The Russians were moving west, joined by the Prussians, who had signed an alliance with Russia. They were looking to take down what they called the bony upstart Corsican. Rival monarchs looked at him as a threat, and I keep saying this. So a new alliance is formed, and this alliance is going to be called the Sixth Coalition. And this is the first time that France would be up against, or Napoleon would be up against, pretty much all of Europe. Meanwhile, Napoleon's troops are younger than ever as he's forming new recruits. Initially, he marches 170,000, and he defeats the Russians and Prussians twice. Now, that's not in your notes. But it's amazing to me how he was able to take a young, inexperienced army after being almost entirely defeated and still be able to bring them into battle. Now, your book really doesn't indicate this. In October in 1813, and I don't think this was in your notes or I missed or in your book, but it's another famous battle. It's called the Battle of Nations at Leipzig. And in this battle, his 1,800 men were soundly beaten by 32, 320,000 Prussians, Austrians, Russians, and Swedes. In this battle, there's 100,000 casualties, mostly French, and Napoleon is forced to retreat, but he refuses to sign any peace treaty or sue for peace or sign it. He calls on fresh taxes and recruits yet again. But at this period of time, the French people say enough. All right, the Allies decided to attack. All right, they swarm over the crumbling empire. The Dutch part of the empire and the Switzerland part had declared independence and rebelled, as well as the Confederation of the Rhine, and Napoleon was utterly defeated. He fought brilliantly, but he was against insurmountable odds. He was tricking himself, thinking that he even had a chance. As enemies approached Paris, people, including his wife and son, fled, and by March, enemy troops had occupied Paris. Urged by Talleyrand, who I mentioned before, he's going to be a famous person who's going to come up, a very famous diplomat. He's kind of a opportunist in many ways. Um, Convinces the Allied leaders to offer the throne to the brother and heir of Louis XVI. To help him restore the monarchy, now remember these are monarchs who are attacking, the treaty to France was very favorable. They did not want to leave France in a vulnerable position where somebody else could attack and build up and shift the balance of power. So in this treaty, they didn't ask for an indemnity, meaning money. They didn't occupy it with troops. And they forced Napoleon to abdicate his throne. And he goes, and this is crazy to me because today, I mean, imagine us taking a foreign leader. Imagine after World War II, Hitler was forced to retire and they gave him his own island. But they basically gave Napoleon an island called Elba, not far off the western coast of Italy. They promised him sovereignty in his miniature little kingdom. He even was able to keep 600 soldiers. I mean, this would never happen today. In this 86 square mile island, all right, the first thing he does is he does what Napoleon does everywhere. He begins to modernize it. He builds new roads, sewers, irrigation systems. He orders silkworm industry, starts building up orders mulberry trees, builds up the silkworm industry, builds hospital, roads, but he gets bored. And that'll lead us to our next slide. So, I don't know if any of you are actually following this, but this is just somehow amusing to me. One of my quotes as a coach is your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. So, what made and brought Napoleon to power is going to lead to his absurd demise. He really just didn't know when to quit. So, I left Napoleon on the island of Elba, and I said he got bored. Well, meanwhile, in France, Louis XVIII became the new king. Now he left the title. If you remember, with Louis XVI was the last king that we talked about. He left the title Louis XVII for the son of Louis XVI, who died at 10 years old in prison in 1795. So Louis wasn't really the best man and I talk about this, the right man at the right time. Like, we're going through major times in the United States right now, and people could agree or disagree whether we have the right man for the situation, but you can't disagree with the fact that it's an important point in American history, and who our ruler is at this time is going to determine a great deal of your future. Now, Louis tried to write a constitution, or the legislature tried to write a constitution and a treaty, which you remember was favorable to France, to limit his power. So again, we're back to square one. What they wanted a constitutional monarchy. They wanted a strong parliament to limit his power. Now, whether that power would be limited by the former nobility, or by the middle class, or by the people, we shall see, actually. But Louis, while he agrees to it, does not agree with it, and he signs it, but he really reserved most of the power for himself. So he was not popular. In mid-February, Napoleon of 1815, Napoleon slips away from Elba with 1,000 men. Now, if you remember, he was left there with 600 men, so somehow he recruited 400 more men, and he landed on the south coast of France. What does Louis do? Well, as Napoleon marched north and encounters forces. Now, these guys had been his men. They'd probably tired of him and constant warfare, but at this period of time, they rally around him. Why? Mostly because Louis the 18th had eliminated many of the people in the military that could have been loyal to Napoleon, did not give them any type of money in their retirement, and was not favorable towards the military that had been created for Napoleon. So Napoleon marches in, basically unopposed, into Paris and into the Tuileries Paris. And this will begin his 100 days as Louis the 18th, I'm not sure if I said this, flees Paris. So, now, other reasons why Napoleon was able to take power. So, like I said, Louis was not very generous to the soldiers who had fought for Napoleon. And the soldiers had enough time to become disillusioned with some of the changes, which, there were rumors that he was going to return feudal dues and the tithe and all the things that started the revolution in the first place. In the meantime, as the blockade of Great Britain was ended, cheap goods are coming into France and the unemployment rate is skyrocketing. So Napoleon recruits one of his most vocal critics to write a new constitution. It's called the Additional Act. You don't need to know that. But it was an addendum to the previous constitution, which made him a constitutional monarch. So remember, he was an emperor, now he's a constitutional monarch, so he's going to be limited by laws. And the new laws are going to defend the freedom of the press and set up a bicameral legislature. So if you remember, bicameral is going to give more power to the people. Less power to the people. So this is going to be a much more conservative legislature, which is going to give Napoleon a little bit more power than a unicameral. So as the powers at this period of time, so the rest of the world is meeting in Vienna trying to negotiate a peace, and they hear that Napoleon has returned. At this point, the Seventh Coalition will form, and this is the whole of Europe joining up against Napoleon yet again. And Napoleon gathers troops, recruits a war, and is able to strike on Prussian and English forces in Belgium. He moves with his trademark speed and secrecy and efficiency and drives a wedge between the two enemies, looking to take them down one at a time. So as he separates the Prussians and the English in Belgium, The English general, the Duke of Marlborough, I'm sorry, it is the Duke of Wellington, I'm sorry. So Wellington finds a spot in Belgium. Now, if you remember correctly, every war always starts through Belgium. I think the first place when the revolutionaries took control was they took Belgium, and Hitler went through Belgium as well. So did Louis XIV. Wellington chooses a spot in Waterloo of open farmland, so the famous Battle of Waterloo. And Napoleon sends his army to chase the Prussians, who he thought he had split the troops, but the Prussians actually head north and evade Napoleon, and Napoleon thinks he can take on just the English in battle. At this period of time, the French outnumber the English, and Napoleon thinks that he has the advantage. So he's going to try to attack at Waterloo and take out the English quickly, and then he can separate them and take out the Prussians, as typical of his strategy. In this battle, the British dig in, and as the French attack and try to outmaneuver the British, there's rumors that circulate that the Prussian troops are closer than Napoleon had thought. So Napoleon is forced to unleash almost everything he has at the center of the British to try to defeat the British before the Prussians can come to their aid. Problem is, the Prussians get there too fast, and Napoleon's forced to just launch everything that he has as the Prussian forces are approaching, and the French end up wavering, and the English break them. It was close. The Prussians break through, and for Napoleon, all was lost. Now, this time, and it still amazes me that they didn't execute Napoleon. We definitely would today because we want to have someone to blame. After his defeat, Napoleon tries for a comeback, but the legislature in France refuses, and the British force Napoleon to St. Helena, which is a rocky island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, 1,200 miles away from the west coast of Africa and 2,000 miles from Brazil, almost dead center in the Atlantic, and there's no place for Napoleon to escape. And this is where Napoleon would ultimately die, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. So, Napoleon would spend his last 6 years of his life in the middle of nowhere on the island of St. Helena. His closest companion included a doctor and 4 French officers. At this period of time of his life, he mostly devotes himself to spinning, quote unquote, his image and his legacy. He eventually develops trouble with his stomach and liver, and there's been all types of conspiracy theories. Theorizing that he was dying of arsenic poisoning and that he was poisoned, but the evidence is historical at best. Most think that he had some form of hepatitis and that stomach cancer was what led to the disease and his death. Either way, his health had fallen sharply and in a downward spiral, and by 1821 Napoleon passes away, surrounded by several of his closest companions. And he dies. And one of the quotes, it's kind of interesting to me, says Napoleon gave up to God the most powerful breath of life that ever animated human clay. It's eerie the amount of power that he was able to hold over so many people. I mean, I don't know if you found his story fascinating, but I do. So he writes a book and he tries to rewrite his story. Now, what was Napoleon's legacy? The revolution itself produced a stunning set of new ideas and practices related to political participation, people's rights, and that egalitarian concept of social equality. Now, Napoleon released may have stabilized France, but he released a tremendous amount of international conflict, and he destabilized much of the politics throughout the rest of Europe. Now, the French Revolution had this effect as well, as we talked about. People were inspired by the French Revolution. Do not think that it was inspired to a great deal by the American Revolution. And this is where our egotism sometimes in history is too much, because the French Revolution is going to have a major effect and bounce back towards the America. Now, America is very conservative in a lot of these ideals because we were built before the liberal French Revolution. So, what are some ideas of Napoleon's legacy? Nationalism, I talked about that. And in the slide, it says became the secular religion of Europe. And I want you to think about what that means. A secular religion. All right. Religion in itself had been Catholicism. People had lived their lives for an ideal of faith. They went to war. We had the Crusades. We had the Protestant wars of religion. We had the Civil War in Great Britain, which was a beginning of secularization. It was half faith-based, but half government or based. But think about today in America where make America great again, that idea of nationalism. Today, we fight more for our country than we do for any other idea. And there's ideas tied to our country. Whether they're real or not is for you to decide. But this idea of nationalism is going to spread and affect the next 200 years of history leading up to World War I and World War II, which is going to be the effects of strong pride in one's country. Second is the Napoleonic Code, the concept of equality before the law. Now, we take that for granted today and we think it's just understood, but in that era, throughout history, it wasn't. And this idea that the average person had rights and that would not be told what to do based on a king, queen, priest, or whatever, and is a concept that's going to spread. Careers open to talent. Another very American idea to work your way up in society, the idea that anybody, as long as you have the most talent, so it's based on merit, based on who is the best, can work their way up. Not based on who you know or who you were born from or your parents, which today we probably see a little bit of both in our system. The second would be representative systems of government. Now, Napoleon's systems of government were not necessarily representative, and that may be an idea that came more from the French Revolution, but there's going to be a demand for individual rights, and he does spread that idea as he invades country. Even though he's oppressive in many of his reforms, he did offer them more rights than they had had before. And the economic policies that facilitate capitalism, meaning state control. All right, so he set up a rich state bureaucracy in every land that he conquered. So there'd be heavy state control that favored the interests of not necessarily the people. All right, so it wasn't egalitarian, but it favored the interests of property men, meaning capitalists. So a slave policy. All right, slavery favors the businesses. All right, it favors capitalism. It favors trade. The idea of banks, of building roads, of the merit-based middle class working their way up. So it was the idea that it wedded government with capitalistic ideas, which is going to be a big part of Western society that is included in Western society today.